Well, it's a distinct pleasure for me tonight to introduce to you and to have a discussion with Carl Wilkens. Carl, he is the only American that stayed behind in Rwanda in 1994 during the genocide. And so, Carl, I just wanted to welcome you and, and to invite you to perhaps start by describing in short what led to the genocide, what was the background behind that, because I think that event surprised many, even heads of state, right, and perhaps even you. So it'll be interesting to put that in perspective a little bit.
The Rwanda of 27 years ago is very, very different of the Rwanda of today. And so I do look forward to sharing with you some of the really hard challenges of 1994, and then how Rwanda was able to move from that horrible time where more than 1 million people were killed over 3 months to where they are today. But a little bit of family background would be our family actually went there to work with ADRA, the humanitarian arm of the Adventist Church, Adventist Development Relief Agency. We were there partnering with the people to build schools, operating clinics. Was really rewarding work. But if we're to go back a little bit to the history, let me just grab a little help here, a little timeline. It's really simple and basic. But in the late 1800s, the Germans were there colonizing. And then after World War I, the Belgians were given the way we won't go into all the ways colonization was happening. But one thing that's important about that time was we were looking at eugenics here in America. Of course, Germany and its story of the master race and all of that version of it was going on there. But even Belgium and Rwanda was looking at this. There were primarily two tribes there. There were three, actually. The largest tribe was Hutu. You can see the Belgians actually introduced putting the ethnicity into the identity card. So in this particular identity card, you can see how Hutu is crossed out. And this person would be a Tutsi, the smaller, like 10, 12%. And the Twa, maybe 1 or 2%, was a real small group. But when we look at kind of some of the roots of the genocide, we definitely look back to this period with the Belgians and this accentuating. There wasn't as much division between the Hutu and Tutsi. When you speak the same language, you're working together, you're in the market together, you're drinking beer together, you're going to fall in love and get married. But what was so destructive about the time of the Belgians and this work, whether they were calling it eugenics or that same concept, was this idea that somehow the Tutsis they were putting forth were superior to the Hutus. So when independence came in 62, there was a backlash. A group of extremist Hutu kind of took a larger role in the government. They called themselves Hutu Power. And many Tutsi people fled the country at that time because of the violence. Many were killed. And I'm sure they thought they'd be able to come home in a month or 2 months, maybe a year at the most. And they weren't allowed back for 30 years. Finally, in 1990, those refugees outside of Rwanda got military training and came back, called the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And that's what we call the 3-year war. And finally, in 93, we thought we were going to have peace. There was a ceasefire. They called it the Arusha Accord. And everybody was going to be part of a new broad-based transitional government. But unfortunately, there was a small element among the Hutu community, politicians primarily, who said, no, we'll never share power. And these are the ones who are going to have not only planned, been crafting a narrative, constructing a story around ethnicities that they're hoping they can use to stay in power. And that story crafted around ethnicities is what will eventually work itself into the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi.
I'm thinking of my own home country, and as well as other places I've been in, and even here in the United States, right? The what do they call it? The melting pot of nations and cultures and ethnicities and everything. And yet we don't see a genocide. So what was different there? What caused that, so to speak?
Very good question. Because we've had wars and we've not had genocides, but yet we've never had genocides without a context of war, some form of war, setting the stage, I would say, creating the environment where this can work. And in this one, yeah, it, among the planners, we're looking at 1994, and among some of the leaders of the extremists who were orchestrating and planning this, they found, Hitler's writings, his book Mein Kampf. These are people who had studied history. They had studied in Europe, in Canada. I say Canada because it was a French-speaking country. They studied in all countries around the world, but especially in other French-speaking countries. And I think part of it is this, students of history, and thinking that, at the time of the Holocaust, they're saying, hey, give us enough time and nobody will even remember this. This idea of impunity seems so attractive when people think they're going to solve a problem by getting rid of somebody. My most basic fundamental definition of genocide is genocide stems from thinking that says my world would be better without you in it. And you're right, Gilly, that doesn't often, that thinking is all over the planet, but it doesn't often end up in genocide. I think we're still asking ourselves the question, why they were successful in Rwanda. And let me say it like this. Some people think that, for example, in Rwanda, that the Hutus and Tutsis hated each other so much, and finally so much friction, it exploded into genocide. And there's just nothing spontaneous about genocide. In fact, I'd say the opposite is more true, that it's hard to pull off a genocide. The planners of the genocide in Rwanda had to work hard to break the bonds of unity among the Hutu and Tutsi, who really married each other all the time, the most intimate unity. Yeah. And so perhaps if we're looking at Rwanda's story and we're saying, why did it end up genocide there and not others? One of the reasons would be, I would say, and there'll be a multitude of reasons, but one of the reasons I would say would be, I had this picture here of the United Nations after the 3-year war in Rwanda, and they signed this ceasefire. Everybody thought, okay, we're going to have peace. And the UN came with 2,500 soldiers saying, hey, good job, Rwanda. You signed an agreement for a transitional government. We're here with you. But I really wish they would have had a little parenthetical statement under the black UN letters there that said, for UN personnel protection only. Oh. So they set up a very deadly false sense of security, which I would say gave the planners of the genocide an advantage, as we're talking about. If you buy into the idea, which I very much do, that it's hard to pull off a genocide, they were able to manipulate the role of the UN in a way that they could use that false sense of security, so people were not trying to find other means to deal with this constructed narrative that the Tutsis are the enemy, that everything is to be blamed on the Tutsi people. Sure. I would say also where ordinary people, school teachers, medical people, religious people could have stood up and taken a leading role against genocide. I think they left it to the UN, or those that were not really interested in peace actually bought into the extremist mentality of the Hutu extremist in the country. So I'm not able to give you a super clear picture why Rwanda was successful. It's easy to say, oh, those people must be different, or they somehow don't respect human life. And yet anybody who goes to Rwanda, they see an incredible hospitality, generosity, welcome. Even you would think today there would be a bitterness against the international community because of the abandonment during the genocide. And you don't sense that
You
bitterness
don't
in
see that.
Rwanda. So I definitely don't write it off to they're somehow different or less humane. If anything, I'd say they're a lot more generous and community oriented than many countries of the world.
One question in this context that maybe you can explore a little bit is the role of media and propaganda. I read your
Sure.
book, and you mentioned a radio
It's a good
station
point.
there that had a significant part in this, apparently. So,
I think another thing that goes right in there with the media and the radio, particularly the radio, is this concept of obedience to authority. Under colonialism, it's a very strong authoritarian approach. And then the independent government that came after colonialism was also super authoritarian. And one of the ways they maintained influence and control over the country
yeah,
was through radio. And when I say influence and control, it's not always like radio was a bad thing. I mean, while we were working there, building schools, operating clinics, we would use the local radio station, the government radio station, when
right.
we were looking for nurses for a clinic
I see.
or, other kinds of public announcements. There was
Sure.
no real television network or much newspapers, not in the big cities, some newspapers, but not throughout the country. The main
Right. Right.
communication throughout the country was the radio. So that radio was the voice of authority for many years in Rwanda. And when
I
the
see.
extremists took over the radio, that's a really good point, Gilly. That was definitely one of the factors that gave them success was the obedience of authority and then the power of the radio. Every home had a radio. And
I
when you
see.
listened and it came over the radio, incredible authority.
Uh huh. Well, if I am a young person who has a bunch of friends and they all listen to the same radio station and we like the same music, and you start to hear all these messages about division and
Hmm.
it probably catches on you, and after a while you feel inclined to do what the others are doing.
Well,
Um,
and you've got another good point there, Gilly, in terms of young people. So much of the killing was done by the Interahamwe, which was largely a youth segment of the extremist party that got expanded during the genocide.
yeah.
And so take the fact that only 1 out of 10 students could get into high school. There just weren't enough schools in Rwanda, not enough, teachers and things.
Sure.
And so those other 9 out of 10 who couldn't get in high school, they were looking to belong somewhere, to have meaning and purpose. I think those are the big things all around the world. People
Right.
want community and they want purpose.
Yep.
And so this extremist party provided those two things for those 9 out of 10 kids who couldn't get into high
Right.
school. And
Right.
of course, once that momentum is building, even the students in high school can be drawn out from that. So really good point.
And here you are, with your family, and you are caught in the middle of this. So one of the things from your book, and I should put a plug in here for your book. I really enjoyed this book. I'm Not
Thank
Living,
you.
and it chronicles in a lot more detail than we can do here those 3 months, about 90 days of the genocide, and what you and your family did during that time. It's an amazing book. In some ways, and I think I told you this, to some extent, I at some point I felt somewhat guilty that it felt to me like I enjoyed the drama, not the killing, not the violence, but that sense of the unexpected, and what's going to happen next, and all of that incredible tension and stress that you're under. I felt like I was reading one of those books when I was a teenager, with these complicated plots and everything. But then this is a very primitive level of perception. Above that, what is overwhelming and was overwhelming for me reading this book is this sense that, wait a minute, this is not a story. This is all real. This thing happened. These
Yeah.
were real people.
Yeah.
These were real victims. And it's so sad and so profoundly disturbing to realize that this is all a real thing that happened, and perhaps could happen again at different levels. So So in that sense, I wanted you to perhaps go through a few of the most impactful stories during that time. And maybe we can start with how you came to the decision to stay
Sure,
while everybody
sure.
else left, essentially, as far as foreigners.
Yeah, we moved there in 1990, and 6 months later, this 3-year war started. Went on through into the summer of '93, and then they had that ceasefire, and we thought we were going to have peace, and the new government should have been launched in December '93, but there was all kinds of people sabotaging that process, and so January, February, March, the tension is building, and in
Mm-hmm.
April 6th is when the president's plane is shot down. He's
Oh,
coming back into land. He was in another country, in Tanzania, working with other African heads of states and other players, trying to get this transitional government unstuck and launched.
sure,
And when he
sure.
comes flying in, April 6,
Ooh,
1994, two surface to air missiles take this jet out of the sky, killing him, as well as the
wow.
president of Burundi. And they started broadcasting on the radio um, the messages that the Tutsis have killed our president. They're going around in the streets. They're telling people, set up roadblocks. You got to find the enemy is among us. The Tutsi killed our president. We got to kill all of them.
Wow.
Children, it doesn't matter, anybody. And any Hutus who don't go along with it, we must kill them too. And the second night of the genocide, Thursday night, a gang gathered at our gate. And here's one of our neighbor ladies who stood in front of our gate and said to this gang there, who I don't know. When I heard, I didn't know about it until the next day because these neighbor ladies turned them away. This was our son's best friend's grandma. She was among those ladies standing at the gate saying, no, you can't go in there. Their kids play with our kids. Basically, these ladies were telling stories about our family, doing little acts of kindness, and turning the tide with this group of men who are ready to attack our home. My best guess is they maybe thought we were a Belgian. And at the same time, there were rumors that, the Belgians were involved with killing the president. Before my wife and I ever made a decision that I would stay, these neighbor ladies stood up for us. Come Friday,
Oh,
the
my.
killing is on a scale that nobody could have really imagined. And I've just put here by this picture how words kill. We thought that the embassy was telling us, just stay in your house and keep your head down. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, these refugee rebel soldiers that I had
Mm-hmm.
told you about during the 3-year war, they had laid down their guns when there's a ceasefire, but when the killing started, they picked up their guns again. And they're the ones who will eventually end the genocide 100 days later. But in those first couple of days, let me move up to here. The American government, along with all the other governments, are saying, got to get all of our people out of there. This is
Right.
just too. This is too unsafe. Even the ambassador, nobody is staying behind. And so, as I was coordinating the evacuation of a group of Americans, because I was responsible, I was a go-between between the embassy and a group of Americans. I was saying to Laura on the radio, Laura, I'm sending the people from the dental clinic to the ambassador's home, over. And she goes, good copy. And I said, and I'm sending my family to the ambassador's home as well, over. She says, wait, what do you mean you're sending them? We're all leaving. And I said, no, I'm not leaving. She said, you don't have a choice. And I said, yes, I do have a choice. And finally she says, well, then I need you to sign on a piece of paper. You refuse the help of the American government to leave. And what was going on here, Gilly, is that they had told us, put a white T-shirt on your vehicle or some sort of white flag and drive to these assembly points. Bring your family. My mom and dad were actually visiting at the time. Bring your family, but don't bring any Rwandans. This is at the root of the decision that my wife and I made, is our
Mm-hmm.
family had grown, so to speak. This young lady lived and worked in our home. She loved on our kids. She was like family. This young man came in the evening as a watchman, both of them with Tutsi ID cards. And we're thinking, we can't leave them here. We're pretty certain they'll be killed. And Rwandans give foreigners such privilege. They treat them with such generosity. And I thought maybe we could use that privilege to
Mm-hmm.
help these two people to survive.
Yeah,
That
I
would be
remember. I remember. Sorry to interrupt. I remember that
no,
sense
not at
of
all.
giving foreigners and for some reason, especially at
Yeah.
least in Romania, Americans, some sort of a special privilege.
Mm.
I guess part of it is historically where the U.S. has been through the Second World War, at least in Europe and other places. But it could be other things. I don't know
Sure.
where this comes from. It's probably
Well,
part of their hospitality tradition too, perhaps.
that's part of it, but
Yeah,
I think part of it too is the ugly part of racism.
true.
And ever since colonial days, foreigners putting themselves
I didn't
forward
think of
as
that.
superior.
Right.
And you live with that for generations, it has an
It
impact, but
becomes like a
it'll
reflex.
be
Yeah.
multi-dimensional. Yeah.
But the thing that I really I think it's important to emphasize in this context is the fact that at that moment you actually felt that you had a real choice. Because for a lot of people, when you are in a situation like that, where even the ambassador says, "Hey, what do you mean? We're all living. There's no
Right,
reason to
right.
stay." This I think is one of the most pivotal moments in the whole story for me. Um, and I know you're a humble person, so you don't want to. And I'm not trying to say that you are different or whatever, superior in some way, but I think the fact that you recognize in that terrible moment that, wait a minute, there is a choice here, and on this choice, it could very well depend the survival of these two people who are now like family. And probably Teresa, your wife, deserves the same amount of credit that she said,
Oh,
"I'm fine with this."
more. I think it would be much harder to leave, somebody behind than to be the one staying behind.
Right,
And so
right.
I do appreciate that point. And I think, your point about choice is really a big one, because I think a lot of times, I mentioned Rwanda and a
Mm-hmm.
culture of obedience to authority, but also that idea of obedience to authority, it's all over it runs throughout every demographic, every
Right,
population group. And
right.
there was another missionary there from Sri Lanka, and I remember when he met Teresa at the ambassador's home. He said, "Where's Carl?" And she said, "Well, he's not leaving." And he said, "What? You mean we could stay?" And I think it wasn't just obedience to authority at times, but it was there were bullets flying all over these people being killed literally by the thousands.
Right.
And so there is, I mean, I look back at it now, Gilly, 27 years ago, and the 63-year-old Carl sometimes looks at the 36-year-old Carl and is like, really? You know? And yet when we're there in the moment, when people are looking you in the face and you believe you can make a difference, you see, that's the big deal. Sometimes we might think that we have a choice, but we don't think we can make any difference.
Right,
And that
right.
belief that we can make a difference
Mm-hmm.
is something I think we can be practicing every day in something even as small as picking up litter or trash.
Correct.
Just
Absolutely.
saying thank you to the people at Taco Bell, or
Yes.
just small kindnesses, small acts to leave the place a little better. Practicing not saying somebody else will do it.
Right,
Those kind of
right.
little somebody else will do it thoughts or statements or practices can lead. You're
Yeah.
you're a doctor and you understand about neuroplasticity and
Mm-hmm.
how habits are formed in our brain, and it's like not just it's some nebulous thing, actual biological,
Absolutely.
synapses. The
Yep.
rewiring of your brain is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so when
Absolutely.
we do small things that we believe make a difference, it's rewiring our brain, I think, that can lead us in larger situations to still believe we can make a difference.
And this is exactly one of the take-home points for our discussion today, as far as I'm concerned. And I can give you a very short personal testimony here since reading your book. I mentioned before we started that I'm in the process of moving my job from one place to another, and there is non-compete clauses. There is all kinds of issues that come in as obstacles in the process. And at some point, I felt a couple of weeks ago that, and I'm not going to give the details, but I'm just going to describe the feeling I had that I was not being treated fair at some point. And I was very tempted to fight it and to stand up for my, and there is place for that, but I think it's very important how we do these things. And personally, I tend to, at times, to be more of a volcanic personality. And I found myself again and again thinking, wait a minute, these are real people. These are people that I'm going to probably meet in another week or two or three at the local grocery store or on the road. And I want to be able to look them in the face and smile and be friends with them rather than fight for what's right or whatever you think
Yeah.
it's yours at that moment. And so that was a moment of inspiration that I drew from your book. So thank you for that.
Well, well, thank you for that too, because that's to me another example of how the people in Rwanda have been working to put things back together. When I'm meeting with students and they're wondering, how can people live together after something like genocide? Uh, I I I put this little drawing up on the screen, and I say, whenever I am angry, frustrated, hurt, offended, confused, I ask myself, wait a minute, who's in the center? And you see, what you just did was after a certain point, you stepped out of the center of the circle and you said, wait a minute, these are people. I'm going to meet
Right.
them on the street. You started
Right.
putting them in the center of the circle. And
Right.
our ability, I mean, it is another way of saying changing perspective, but to me, this just somehow is a little more concrete than simply saying another perspective. This
Right.
ability we have to step out of the center and put somebody else in the center, I think is directly related to our ability to build peace or to repair relationships or to avoid, destroying relationships.